Hey, here are a couple questions. Has the messaging from the Democrats changed over the past few years? Is the messaging more jingoistic, more saber rattling? Have they become the party of militarism? Let's find out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.
Welcome to the Connecting the Dots podcast with Dr. Wilmer Leon. I am Wilmer Leon. Here's the point. We have a tendency to view current events as though they happen in a vacuum, failing to understand the broader historical context in which they take place. During each episode, my guests and I have probing, provocative, and in-depth discussions that connect the dots between these events and the broader historic context in which they occur, thus enabling you to better understand and analyze the events that impact the global village in which we live. On today's episode, the issue before us is militarism and messaging. My guest is a man who holds a PhD in American history from Brandeis University. He's the managing editor of Covert Action magazine. He's the author of 5 books on U.S. foreign policy. He's the author of a piece at Covert Action entitled DNC Convention Features Former CIA Director Who Was in Charge of Drone Programs That Killed Thousands. He is Dr. Jeremy Kuzmarov. Jeremy, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. Great to be with you.
You open your piece in Covert Action as follows. Leon Panetta was drowned out by anti-war activists when he spoke at the 2016 convention, but not this time. Former CIA Director Leon Panetta, who was the director from 2009 to 2011, was among the featured speakers on the final day of the DNC in Chicago on August 22nd, when Kamala Harris accepted the party's nomination as its presidential candidate. Jeremy, does this represent just a shift in rhetoric, or is this a shift in policy and a shift in direction?
Well, I think we see a lot of continuity. I mean, Panetta was there in 2016. He's giving the same kind of speech 8 years later. In 2016, he was really promoting these anti-Russia themes, anti-Putin. This was the forerunner of the Russiagate. You know, they were already attacking Donald Trump as a Russian agent. And his speech in 2024 was the same kind of thing. You know, it was really very jingoistic, militaristic. In that speech, he was reinvoking the glory of the Obama administration assassination of Osama bin Laden, or alleged assassination, because there are a lot of different theories about what really might have gone on there. And the official story was shown to be a lie. Seymour Hersh had a piece that was very good, and he, compared it to Alice in Wonderland, and their rhetoric was so far out there as to what really is known to have happened. And yeah, there are a lot of question marks. They dumped the body at sea, so there's no autopsy, and some question if that was even bin Laden. Some people believe he died years earlier from renal failure. But in any event, that's the kind of thing they were doing, just touting the war on terror, the U.S. military. Panetta said something that, America made the mistake of trying to be isolationist in the 1930s. And there's this kind of insinuation you can't appease, Putin as if he's the new Hitler. And America was not really isolationist. It was a global empire starting in the late 19th century when it acquired the Philippines and Puerto Rico and Cuba, and functioned as a global empire from that time period. So never really isolationist. And FDR, had this major naval buildup in the Asia Pacific that essentially provoked the Pacific War. It was a horrific war. So, I mean, he obviously doesn't know his history that well, but this is just, theater. Yeah, it's a very hawkish theme he's advancing. And his speech echoed Kamala Harris's speech, and this, anti-Russia themes, pro-military themes. So that's what you get nowadays out of the Democratic Party. And yeah, there were boos of Panetta in 2016, but it was quiet this time around. And it seems that people are just trying to mobilize around Harris and the embers of the anti-war movement. I mean, there were protesters outside. of the convention. A lot of that centered exclusively on Israel, Palestine. So I don't know. I mean, I think the protesters in 2016 were part of the Bernie Sanders faction. Maybe they had some hope in the party then, but now I think anti-war people have no hope in the Democratic Party, so they left, or some were outside protesting.
Well, in fact, that was really the crux of my question: Panetta's rhetoric versus the convention's response. And does the convention's response, or some might say lack of response, indicate that there's a serious shift in the party, particularly as we look at how easily warmongering legislation gets passed through Congress, through the Democratic elements of Congress, as it relates to funding for Ukraine and funding for Gaza, and more jingoistic rhetoric as it relates towards China?
Absolutely. And I think it's telling that, Robert Kennedy and Tulsi Gabbard are considered more peace candidates, and they've made a lot of statements critical of U.S. foreign policy, especially regarding Ukraine, less so for Kennedy and I think also Gabbard, Israel, Gaza, but definitely Ukraine. They've both been very critical and called for easing of relations with Russia, and they've warned about the threat of nuclear war and that we're in an era of new Cuban Missile Crisis. They've compared it to, and they were booted out of the party. I mean, Tulsi, and they were treated horribly, beyond just debate. Gabbard, she was in one of the CNN debates or televised debates in 2020 as she was, running in the primary, and she was viciously attacked by Hillary Clinton and Kamala Harris and others who dominate the party in kind of neo-McCarthyite terms. And they called her a Putin stooge and a Bashir Assad apologist because she was against the covert operations in Syria and the escalation of conflict. And somehow, they called her all these kind of names and really treated her in the way that Joseph McCarthy would recognize, or victim of McCarthyism. Was reminiscent of that. So she was totally driven out of the party. Now you find her more on Fox News. I think that the Republicans are trying to capitalize on the disaffection of many pacifists and peace-oriented people with the Democrats, and they're trying to recruit them and draw them into the fold. And that's why they brought in Kennedy and Gabbard. But personally, I think that they're just they're very cynical. Operatives in the Republican Party are just trying to get that vote, but they're not really peace-oriented party either. And Trump's foreign policy was very bellicose and aggressive in many ways, certainly toward Latin America. The drone war, Trump escalated the drone war, escalated the war in Somalia. And he's very aggressive in his and very xenophobic and threatens a major escalation, I think, with China. So I think it's just a cynical ploy by the GOP to try and get these disaffected people who are disaffected with the Democrats, and by recruiting Kennedy and Gabbard to kind of create this persona as the new peace party. But I don't think they really are a peace party. And so those of us who are really committed to pacifism and anti-imperialistic politics really have nowhere in the mainstream American politics. And I think we should work on developing our own independent parties.
Before I get back to your piece, you mentioned in your earlier answer a reference to people trying to compare former President Trump to Hitler. And I was at the RNC when J.D. Vance his name was placed in nomination, and he accepted the nomination. And I was doing my stand-up after the nomination, and I was saying, as I was closing my analysis, I said, I find it very interesting, if not ironic, that a guy who just a couple of years ago was comparing Donald Trump to Adolf Hitler is now his vice presidential nominee and will be standing next to him on stage. I said, how does that happen? And when I said that, there was a guy standing next to me who turned to my cameraman and said, you guys have to leave. You have to leave right now. He was allowing us to use his space, so he was able to tell us that. But my point is, as soon as I said that, you guys got to go. You got to go right now. Is that explain that? Because I find it amazing, and only now would something like that happen in our politics.
Yeah, well, I think it's increasingly like out of the twilight zone. I mean, well, firstly, I think a lot of the rhetoric is a bit overblown. I mean, I think Trump, there are certain fascist themes in the GOP, and there are concern about ascendant fascism and authoritarianism both among both parties. I mean, the scapegoating of immigrants in the GOP, the extreme nationalism, ultra militarism, like veneration of the military. That bears fear that the GOP is leaning in a fascist direction. I mean, I think some of the rhetoric about Hitler may be overblown, but yeah, it's totally ironic that he was calling him Hitler, as you say, and then he's the nominee. So that's just insane. But why did they kick you out? I mean, you were just repeating a fact that is known to be a fact, and that goes to the growing authoritarianism we see, that you can't. Like the kind of conversations we're having are not tolerated in the mainstream, and just a journalist doing his job and just reporting on something is being removed. That
can get you arrested and detained.
Yeah.
In airports, and have your home raided by the FBI, as with Scott Ritter and Omali Yeshitela and the Uhuru 3.
Yes, and this is I think what we're seeing is a more overt form of authoritarianism, and I think it's showing the facade of American democracy. I mean, on paper there has been a democracy, but in reality, for years and generations, dissidents have been ostracized and marginalized, and faced a lot of persecution. Maybe not, physical violence, although, I mean, under FBI COINTELPRO, there were a lot of victims of state repression, people who were unjustly incarcerated, sometimes for decades. There were people killed. I mean, the FBI infiltrated leftist and radical groups with the goal of destroying them and creating divisions. And like in the Black Panther, they orchestrated murders. So, I mean, they're the very violent underbelly of American politics, and that's coming more to the surface more and more. And I mean, you see, look, the Mark Zuckerberg said that Biden administration told him to censor
the Hunter Biden laptop story.
Yeah, well, the Hunter Biden laptop and related to COVID-19, and whatever your view on that, people should have a right to express it. But Zuckerman was told to censor views that criticized the government position, and and then you have these raids going on.
Wait a minute, because it's important. I think that people really clearly understand that the point that you just made about Zuckerberg, that's not your opinion. He stated that in a letter that he wrote to Congressman Jim Jordan. And so those who want to, wait a minute, what is Jeremy talking about? Right? Google it. You can read the letter for yourselves. It was sent last week. And Zuckerberg made those very clear statements and was apologetic for having done what he did in censoring those stories on Facebook, because he has since come to understand that, contrary to as he was told, those were not Russian propagandist talking points.
Exactly. Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. And another fact is that Tim Walz made statements supporting censorship if it was related to misinformation, and that seems to be the line of the Democratic Party. But they use misinformation. Could be anybody who's simply critical of the government. They call it somebody who criticizes government policy in Ukraine or vis-a-vis Russia. They say he's promoting misinformation or Russian propaganda, or the same for the COVID narrative. They question the dominant narrative. So, I found in a review of Waltz's statements, he promoted misinformation. So, he, for instance, he claimed that Bashir al-Assad carried out chemical attacks on his own people, and that was refuted by scientists like Theodore Postel, did a very detailed scientific study, and I did an article, and I interviewed Postal, and he showed me his data. And this guy, the top flight MIT scientist, and he repudiated these claims, his analysis, and he was very neutral. He wasn't really on any side of the war, and he wasn't even particularly political. It was a very objective scientific study that, based on the angles, those attacks had to have occurred from certain areas that were, that were controlled by the rebels, not the Assad government, and that other attacks, he didn't think that there were chemical attacks. There was a bombing of a fertilizer plant. In another case, some stuff may have been planted, like dead animals, to make it look like an attack, because people would have been dead. He said, he showed me photos, and he had images of photos where people who were on the scene would have immediately been killed if there was actually a chemical weapon attack the way they described it, and they weren't affected or sick in any way. So in any event, that's just an example of Waltz can be seen to have promoted misinformation. So based on his own statements, he should censor himself. But the broader point is the American Constitution and the American Republic was founded on the ideal of free speech, and that's what we should have. And this cancel culture, I think too often on the left, people support censorship under the guise of a cancel culture, and I think that's very dangerous. And I think people are smart enough to see which ideas are good or bad for themselves. They don't need to have this censorship. It serves no purpose, even for somebody who is promoting bad things or false information. You don't have to censor them, because people are smart enough to see there's no evidence behind what he's saying, which is often true, sadly, of the U.S. government. And that's why they lose credibility.
I've asked this question of a number of guests, Caleb Maupin, and I think Dr. Gerald Horn and a few others, that talking about censorship in the United States, engagement in censorship, that if you look over history, particularly since World War I, this whole idea of censorship really comes to a height when the United States feels threatened. And then once the perceived enemy is vanquished, then the whole focus on censorship tends to wane, if not go away. And so I'm wondering if now, because we're seeing heightened censorship, if that's an indication to you how threatened the United States empire feels.
I think so, yeah. Censorship goes hand in hand with war. War is the enemy, really, of democracy. And we've been in a state of permanent war since 9/11. And I think they manufactured this new Cold War for sustaining the military-industrial complex police state, which has to go hand in hand with censorship. And we've seen more authoritarian forms of government, even toward the domestic population, heightened militarized policing in inner cities. We've seen the government stripping funding from vital social programs. And that's automatically going to generate more and more dissent and dissatisfaction with the government and living conditions. So they have to ratchet up censorship and more authoritarian, greater authoritarianism. And that's the only way they can sustain their power. And, they've really lost their governing legitimacy. If you talk to people from all walks of life, whether in liberal areas, conservative, you find almost universally people distrust the government and are not happy with the direction of the country, and more are speaking out. So they have to censor them and try and control the media and channel any dissent. They want to kind of channel it and co-opt it. And that's why a lot of the media has been co-opted. They're CIA or FBI infiltrators in media, even alternative media.
In fact, to your point about people being dissatisfied with the direction of the country, if you go to Real Clear Politics, those polled 26.9% believe the country's heading in the right direction. 63.4% believe that the country's on the wrong track. So again, I try my best to give as much data as I can to support the positions that are being stated so that people can understand that this is substantive analysis that we're providing, because talk without analysis is just chatter, and we don't chatter here. Let's go back to your piece. You write, Panetta said that Harris would fit the bill as a tough commander-in-chief to defend the USA against tyrants and terrorists. According to Panetta, Harris knows a tyrant when she sees one and will stand up to them, unlike Donald Trump, who Panetta suggested had coddled dictators such as Putin and effectively told them they could do whatever they want. Why is that exchange or that recounting by Panetta troublesome to you?
Well, firstly, yeah, and the statistics you're citing indicate that many Americans are increasingly seeing their own government as tyrannical. And they're tired. This is the kind of tired rhetoric we've seen over and over to justify these, foreign adventures and unjust and unnecessary wars that further divert our treasury away from actually solving the problem in our society. And yeah, we see.
Wait a minute. And many will tell you, because I've been having this conversation for at least 8 years, that that's the intent. That the objective has always been to heighten the sense of insecurity within the country so that social program funding, social safety net funding could be shifted away from the public to the private military industrial complex. And they talked about this when Obama came into office. They talked about this. I know I have it backwards. When Clinton came into office, they talked about this. When Biden came into office, they said, the narrative is more subtle with the Democrats, but the objective is still the same.
Yeah, and the rhetoric, as you see, they're really attacking Trump from the right, and they're positioning themselves as more hawkish, and that's why a lot of the neoconservatives have moved into the Democratic Party. And William Kristol, who is this neoconservative intellectual and a great cheerleader for the Iraq War, he sent out a tweet. Leon Panetta quoting Ronald Reagan at the Democratic Convention. This is my kind of Democratic Convention, or a CIA director quoting Ronald Reagan. So, and yeah, you see from that statement you read, Trump is somehow soft on the Russians. But if you actually look at Trump's policy toward Russia, he pulled out of the INF treaty, which is a very good arms limitation treaty. He ratcheted up these sanctions from hell on Russia. He ratcheted up arms sales to Ukraine. He sold Javelin anti-tank missiles, which Obama had up to that point hadn't sold. So he was not soft at all, and he was plotting regime change. I mean, there's a lot of continuity in foreign policy. You see a lot of continuity among administrations. So Trump's approach really was not very different from Obama. He's just kind of expanding on things Obama was doing, and then Biden takes it to a further level of provoking all-out war and attacking Russia directly. So the rhetoric is meaningless, but yeah, it's designed to inculcate fear. I agree with your analysis. That they just try and make us fearful and on edge, whether it's of the next disease pandemic or the next threat. I mean, they're always playing up the threat of North Korea or Iran. I mean, look at North Korea. I mean, North Korea was bombed back to the Stone Age by the United States during the Korean War, and the U.S. pumps South Korea with weaponry and stores nuclear weapons there. I mean, obviously, North Korea is going to respond. I mean, developing a nuclear weapon is their only way to save their country and survive as a nation. I mean, they see what happened to Libya, but our media doesn't present it in that way, or our political elites, they present it like North Korea is some threat, a major threat to us, led by this crazy dictator. But they give no context for why North Korea would invest in nuclear weapons or missiles, and how a lot of their weapon development is just designed to protect themselves from the threat of renewed invasion and being destroyed again as they were in the Korean War. But they never give the history or the context. So the public who believes that rhetoric, in fear of North Korea one day, Iran another day, Putin, is presented in the most demonized way conceivable, a totally kind of cartoonish way as this evil Hitler-type figure. So we're supposed to fear him one day, and that's how they do it, and that's how they justify this huge military budget that's approaching $1 trillion now. And yeah, I mean, the government spends a pittance on social welfare programs and education and healthcare infrastructure. I mean, that's what the government should be doing, should be helping to create a better society, better living conditions here at home. But instead, they spend $1 trillion on weapons, and that comes back. And now you have the law like the USA Patriot Act and the 1290D program, where all that Pentagon weaponry gets put into our police forces, who become more like occupying armies in inner cities, and their mistreatment of minority groups. So it's an ugly picture. Yeah.
You mentioned Libya, and I think we can tie this to your piece. You mentioned Libya, and people need to remember that the execution of Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi took place under the Obama administration. Hillary Clinton was his Secretary of State, and it was Hillary Clinton and I believe Samantha Power that convinced then President Obama to execute Gaddafi. And so if we understand a lineage of thought from Hillary Clinton, her predecessor, Madeleine Albright, she was a student of Zbigniew Brzezinski, so who was a Russophobe, and so there's a lineage of thought within the State Department, and now we have to understand that Vice President Harris is an acolyte of Hillary Clinton.
Yeah, and Hillary Clinton is a very dangerous figure, and I wrote a book on Bill Clinton, and I did a lot of research on their career, Bill's career as the governor of Arkansas, so I learned a lot about Hillary, and even from that time, she's a very corrupt individual. Clinton was tied with the national security establishment. He oversaw a major covert operation in Arkansas to arm the Nicaraguan counter-revolutionaries, and they laundered a lot of money through illicit proceeds, and they would bring back drugs as part of these arms smuggling operations. And Hillary worked for the Rose Law Firm and was representing clients who were involved in money laundering in Arkansas banks. And she was always known as a hawk, so she's very unprincipled, corrupt person who was involved in also all kinds of schemes to raise money for Clinton's campaigns that should have put her in prison. And then, she was always known as a war hawk. She evolved into a major war hawk. There was a very good article in the New York Times, a rare good article, New York Times Magazine, called Hillary the Hawk, and it surveyed her career. Going back to the Kosovo War, she was a big proponent of the bombing there. She supported the Iraq War. Every war she supported. And her hawkishness came out in Libya, where she was gloating after Gaddafi was lynched. She gloated. We saw he died, and she was so happy about it and like giggling. And that was a disgrace comparable to Iraq. The Libya was a well-functioning country under Gaddafi's rule. He may have had certain authoritarian features, but he used Libya's oil resources to develop their economy, to invest in education. I met a number of Libyans who were able to get free education abroad. The Libyan government paid for their education abroad, and they came back to work to develop their country.
Wait a minute. To that point, I was teaching at Howard University at the time, and I came across some Libyan students, and I asked them who was paying their tuition, and they didn't understand the concept of tuition. They were saying, well, wait a minute, why would you pay to go to college? Help us understand why they could not put their head around paying for tuition. And I don't think it's a stretch for me to say that at the time that Gaddafi was the leader of Libya, that Libya was one of, if not the most stable country on the continent. It had one of the strongest economies on the continent, and Gaddafi was developing his country, developing his agriculture. He was, as they called it, greening the desert. Libya had some of the purest water in the world, some of the deepest water table. And one of the big issues was he saw himself as an African, not an Arab.
Yeah, and I visited Zambia. My ex-wife was from Zambia, and I visited there in 2007. And Gaddafi came during my visit, and he was greeted as a hero because he was using Libya's oil resources to promote development projects across the African continent. And he was seen as somebody, yeah, who stood up for African and was carrying on the tradition of Pan-Africanism of figures who were revered in Africa, like Kwame Nkrumah. And Nelson Mandela, and he was seen as an heir to that tradition. And then he was overthrown and treated worse than a dog. And Libya has now seen the return of slavery. Violent extremism has come into the country, just pure chaos. And a lot of Libyans have had to flee to Europe. And then the Europeans, under perilous conditions in these boats, and then Europeans complain about immigration. I mean, they turned Libya into a hellhole, and the cost in lives, and it's just sickening. And Clinton was just laughing all about it and thought it was funny. And I think, Kamala Harris seems to be on that intellectual level. She laughs at inappropriate moments. I've seen her. She doesn't seem to have a good grasp of world affairs. And she's close with some terrible leaders around the world, like the Washington Post reported that she has developed, as vice president, an unusually close relationship with Ferdinand Marcos Jr., and he's the son of one of the worst dictators the U.S. supported in the Cold War, Ferdinand Marcos Sr., who looted the Filipino treasury and killed who knows how many dissidents. And his son seems to be picking up where the father left off. He jailed Walden Bello, who's a great intellectual in the Philippines, who was running for an opposition party. And, they're building up U.S. military bases in Philippines to confront China. And Harris went to ink some base deal a couple of years ago, and there were a lot of protesters for her visit. But yeah, this is one of the dictators she's very close with. So she's following this imperialistic tradition. And yeah, there should be, again, a lot of people have left the Democratic Party because they see no hope in it. But this, it's troubling when this is supposedly the more liberal and humane party, and this is what they're doing.
And folks, we're connecting the dots here. That's the purpose of this podcast, is connecting, linking dots, linking historic events so that you can see the trend, you can see the pattern, you can understand what's really going on behind the scenes. Let's go to Vice President Harris's speech at the convention. She says, "As Commander-in-Chief, I will ensure America always has the strongest, most lethal fighting force in the world, and I will fulfill our sacred obligation to care for our troops and their families. She'll always honor their sacrifice," as she should. But the strongest, most lethal fighting force in the world, that now, Jeremy, seems to be really throwing good money after bad, because the issue now, at least in terms of the geopolitical landscape, is economic. It's not militarism. It's the United States that seems to be using militarism as its only weapon, and I use that euphemistically, against this unipolar to multipolar shift with the rise of BRICS and the Chinese Cooperation Organization. They're fighting an economic war with militarism.
Yeah, and actually it was ironic that, she made those statements, and that week the New Yorker published these photos from 2006 Haditha massacre, where the U.S. military massacred all these Iraqi civilians, and there were these horrible photos you may have seen,
yes,
of children who had been shot by U.S. Marines or soldiers. So what is having the most lethal military force in the world? What does that mean? You go into a country like Iraq and shoot up women and children? I mean, is this something to strive for? And then, as you say, this military force is getting us nowhere. I mean, it's just causing backlash against the United States. I mean, yeah, look in Africa, they all these new governments have come in and they're kicking out the U.S. military. They don't want the bases in their country, like in Niger For example, the huge drone base that was removed. And I mean, Ukraine.
Just recently, a couple of soldiers within the last couple of days were harassed in Turkey. And Dr. Horn was saying that this is not an isolated incident, that when you see something like this happening on the streets of Turkey, or as many still know it as Turkey, that this is an indication that the people are rising up, not the leadership, the people.
Absolutely. And we see, the United States is a paper tiger. I mean, look at Ukraine, billion and billion of weaponry, and Russians are gaining more and more territory every day. It's reported that even as Ukraine is taking the war into Russia, Russia's taking more territory in eastern Ukraine every day than they were before. Israel is doing nothing in Gaza. They just leveled the place, killed, according to the Lancet report, now it's about a month ago, 186,000 civilians. Now they're attacking people in the West Bank, but they've achieved nothing militarily. And the United States wars were all failures. In the last generation, you have Libya. I mean, they turn countries into chaos, but ultimately they don't achieve the broader goal they set out. I mean, look at Afghanistan, 20 years, and they achieved nothing, and the Taliban came back in. And it's just money.
Lockheed Martin and McDonnell Douglas made a hell of a lot of money in Afghanistan. They achieved something.
Yeah, that's all they achieved.
Stock value went up pretty high.
Yeah, and I think the public needs to channel their revolt against those companies in the military-industrial complex, because it's their hard-earned taxpayer dollar. They're getting absolutely nothing for it. People are getting killed around the world. That weaponry is being sent to U.S. police forces after the military, used equipment. It's creating a more authoritarian environment here. And a few fat cats, what they used to call merchants of death, are getting rich. And there should be a revolt against those people, because they've grown rich off the misery and death of other humans. And it's not a way to run an economy or a society rooted in violence and just the wealth of a tiny number off the misery of everybody else. And horrific weapon. We've never seen in human history the kind of horrific weapon they're developing now. It's unfit for humanity. And there is movements to try and get universal bans on certain kinds of weapons. And that should certainly be supported as well.
In her speech, she also said, let me say, I know there are people of various political views watching tonight, and I know I promise, and I want you to know, I promise to be president for all Americans. You can always trust me to put country above party and self, to hold sacred America's fundamental principles, from the rule of law to free and fair elections to the peaceful transfer of power. Well, when you look at the data and you look at the polling, an overwhelming majority of Americans, even Jewish Americans, want an end to the United States involvement in the genocide in Gaza. Now, she's saying that she promises to be the president of all Americans, but she, and I put this on her because this was her convention, would not allow a Palestinian spokesperson, a representative of that position, on the stage. Is that tone deaf, or is it evidence that she's a Zionist and she's down with the mission? Or both?
Yeah. Well, I think it's an illusion. They were trying to claim at the convention that she was working tirelessly for a ceasefire and for peace in the Middle East. And that's simply a lie. The Biden administration it's been a joint U.S.-Israeli operation in Gaza. And we should recognize that Israel is basically a proxy of the United States empire in the Middle East, that the U.S. has used Israel. The reason they've given all those weapons to the Israelis over years now that Israel has served a key function for the U.S. empire in the Middle East and accessing Middle East oil. Israel provides U.S. military bases, and it does a lot of the dirty work for the U.S. empire going back years. For instance, in the Six-Day War, the Israelis humiliated the U.S. nemesis Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was like Gaddafi, started as a pan-Arabist, and he was in the mold of Nasser, who had moved to nationalize the Suez Canal and nationalize the oil resources, and was forged alliance with Syria and forged the United Arab Republic with Syria, and was promoting Arab unity so the Arab states could go strong in the face of Western imperialism and reclaim control of their chief natural resource, oil. And obviously, the CIA tried to overthrow Nasser. They even sent in Kermit Roosevelt, the coup master, who had been in Iran, but he failed. But Israel did the job. With the Six-Day War, they humiliated Nasser. And by that point, Israel was getting a lot of the U.S. weapons already. It started in the Kennedy administration, where he basically opened the spigots, and Johnson was a huge supporter militarily of Israel. And Israel also carried a lot of covert operations in Africa that have served U.S. interests, including countries like in Congo, where they help access the mineral wealth of the Congo. So, and Israel, has gone after the Assad dynasty was an enemy of the United States and West because they were more allied with Nasser in his day and the Soviet Union, and they're more nationalistic. So that the regime the U.S. doesn't like. And they've used Israel to, Israel has been bombing Syria for a long time now and has tried to, has gone after Assad. So these are just examples of how Israel does some of the dirty work of the United States and functions as a proxy of the United States. So the country basically are arm in arm together, and they may pay, for public relations purposes if Netanyahu is seen a bit extreme among some of their base or among some of the electorate. They may try and take a public distance or say they're trying to moderate his behavior, but I think that's more for public relations. They continue to provide him the weapons he needs, and they're not going to do anything. The last president who had a kind of even-handed approach in the Middle East was, to some extent, with Dwight Eisenhower, who when Israel and Britain and France invaded Egypt, and after Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, Eisenhower imposed sanctions on Israel and threatened a wider embargo and even to punish Israel in the United Nations. But they would never do that today. They're just giving cover and the weapons and diplomatic support in the UN for Israel's conduct and ethnic cleansing or genocide, whatever you want to call it. And I think they support the U.S. imperialists support the project of a greater Israel, the Israeli far right. That their goal is to expand the Israeli polity, to basically remove the Palestinians and to use their land for broader projects, canal building, to increase the water resource in Israel, access offshore oil. And the U.S. supports that because they want a stronger Israel, because that's their proxy in the Middle East. And the U.S. wants to dominate the Middle East and its oil resources for the next several generations, and they need Israel for that.
We could spend a whole nother hour on this next question, but if you could just clarify a point that you just made. You mentioned Kermit Roosevelt, you mentioned the United States going in and overthrowing Nasser, and you said they failed in Iran. But
They failed in Egypt. They succeeded in Iran.
Kermit Roosevelt and Norman Schwarzkopf Sr. went in and overthrew Mohammad Mossadegh and installed the Shah. That's why I wanted clarification, because I thought you said, and I could have misunderstood you. I thought you said they failed in Iran.
No, my point was they succeeded in Iran. Kermit Roosevelt was the coup master.
Right.
Then they sent him to Egypt to get rid of that thorn in their side, Gamal Abdel Nasser, because of his pan-Arabism. But there he failed. Nasser was very popular, and he couldn't work the same magic, or they didn't have the right people to get rid of him. So that's when Israel stepped in, and it was beefed up by U.S. arms supplies. And in 6 days, they humiliated him, and they provoked that war. It's been admitted by top Israeli leaders and generals, that they provoked that war. They humiliated Nasser, and 3 years later he died, and he was replaced by Anwar Sadat, who was much more pro-West and abandoned his pan-Arab ideology.
And also, again, this could be a whole nother show, but just quickly, you were talking about Israel being a U.S. proxy, and you've mentioned this before, but I think folks, we're connecting the dots here. Pay attention. We're connecting the dots. Ukraine is operating in a similar fashion as a U.S. proxy in that part of the world as Israel is acting in the Middle East. And so, because look, folks, the Ukraine war is lost. It's lost. And people say to me, Wilmer, you said that the war would be over in 2 years, and I was right. As Putin wound up negotiating with I'm drawing a blank on the Ukrainian president's name,
Zelensky,
Volodymyr Zelensky, and he holds up the paper and says, "We negotiated a settlement." The U.S. sends in Boris Johnson to say, "We're not going to accept this. The West will not. Hence, the war is ongoing." Ukraine has no tanks of its own. They're now having to go into their prisons and empty their prisons to send convicted murderers to the front line. They don't have an army of their own anymore. They don't have artillery of their own anymore. They don't have jets of their own anymore. Everything they're using comes from NATO and comes from the West. And it's a very same situation in Israel. Again, that could be a whole show of itself, but I just wanted to quickly connect the dots between the proxies in Israel and the proxies in Ukraine.
Yeah, and I would add the point that the United States and the people of those countries should understand, and I think this is American Jews should understand, that the United States doesn't care about the people. They're using them for their own agenda. And look, Ukrainian has suffered terribly through their alliance with the United States. They never would have gone to war with Russia. Ukraine and Russia got along. You know, they had some issues, but they resolved it. And maybe the Ukrainians felt slighted in some way toward the Russians, but they weren't stupid enough to take up arms against the Russians and annihilate themselves. But they thought because they had the United States and all these weapons that they could take on the Russians, and they made the same mistake as Napoleon or Hitler. I mean, the Russians are, you know, I spent time in Russia. They're very patriotic people, and they will defend their country. And this was a war provoked by the United States basically used, and the Russians know this, that the U.S. was using Ukraine as a battering ram against Russia. And they're going to defend themselves. And in the Israeli case, look, the Israeli security has suffered tremendously. Now they're inviting attack from all their enemies, and they've shed so much blood. They're going to invite vengeance and retaliation against them. The security situation very poor in Israel. I would not want to live in Israel. And they could invite one day their own destruction. Already they've compromised the moral of their society. Israel was founded as a haven for Jewish people, and a lot of very idealistic people were part of the original Zionist movement. I mean, the kibbutz was a concept of a cooperative model of an economy. But look at Israel today. It's this armed military state that is a pariah around the world because of the atrocity that's carried out with support by the United States, doing the United States dirty work. And it's eviscerated its own democracy. I mean, it's become very repressive there. Journalists who are trying to report on what's going on in Gaza have been, I don't know, I think they've been certainly blacklisted, if not jailed.
Or shot.
I mean, it's just evolved as a violent authoritarian state that's king of assassination. Mossad carries out assassinations around the world. It's hated and feared. It has an extreme right-wing government. This is not the ideal of a lot of the original Zionists, and a lot of American Jews are very uncomfortable with the direction of that society. They should be, and it could invite their own destruction one day. So, I mean, that's a lesson you can take. If you ally with the empire, they'll use you for their own purpose, and ultimately they'll spit you out. I mean, ask the Kurds, ask the Hmong and Lao. They've used proxies in other countries, and those proxies got totally destroyed, like the Hmong and Laos or the Kurd, and they'll abandon them when it doesn't suit their agenda. They may find somebody else. And Ukrainian society has been destroyed. Yes, 500,000 youth have been killed. They don't even have enough people. How are they going to run their economy when all the youth of the country have been killed? Others had to flee. They don't want to fight on the front lines. Yeah, they've sacrificed them as pawns in this war. It's sad.
And Senator Lindsey Graham goes to Ukraine and encourages the Ukrainians to fight and to continue to fight. And let me just give you a quick analogy. Imagine a boxing match, and one of the cornermen is getting paid not for the win, but for the number of rounds his fighter engages in. And so that's Lindsey Graham. He's the cornerman. His guy, both of his eyes are damn near shut. He can't breathe. His lips are swollen. His head has all kind of knots on it. And he keeps sending his guy out there to get slaughtered because he gets paid by the round instead of the knockout. Is that a fair analogy?
Absolutely, yeah. And I studied the history of the Vietnam War, and one thing I remember, I used to show students the TV history of the Vietnam War, and they had one. It was made in the 80s. They had one segment on the secret war in Laos, like what I was saying with the Hmong, who they used to fight the left-wing Pathet Lao. And William Colby came on, was interviewed some years later. He was the CIA director. And he said, oh, well, that was a great project for us. The Hmong lasted 10 years. It's exactly what you're saying. Yeah, they lasted 10 rounds, but then they got killed. All of them. The Hmong were decimated, and they had to send, that's what the Ukrainians are doing. The Hmong had to send 14-year-olds to the front lines, and a CIA operative started to feel bad. He's like, we're sending these 14-year-olds on these planes to be killed, and I know they'll be killed. And I'm like telling their parents, I'm patting them on the back, and they'll be killed next week. And that's what's happening with Ukraine. And Graham won't send his own kids. I mean, if there's a real reason to fight a war, you have to fight. If you're a real man, you'll fight it because there's a real reason. Your community's under attack, or there's a real threat of Hitler. But instead, they manufacture these wars and cowardly send and manipulate other people to fight and die. And that's the worst form of cowardice and manipulation I could think of in human society.
As we wrap this up, and folks, we're connecting dots. And if you don't like what we're saying, if what we're saying makes you angry, as Malcolm said, if my telling you the truth makes you angry, don't get angry at me, get angry at the truth. And you can look all of this up. I want to get back to your piece. You quoted, and you mentioned this earlier, but Panetta quotes Ronald Reagan at a speech at the DNC. And he emphasized that, quote, isolationism never was and never will be an acceptable response to tyrannical government, end quote. You write, Panetta ended his speech by highlighting that Harris was a good choice to reinvigorate American world leadership as she worked with 150 foreign leaders as vice president, served on the Senate Intelligence Committee, worked closely with Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine to fight against Russia. And you go on a number of things. You mentioned, you say that Panetta provided a litany, my word, not yours, of misinformation and disinformation in that part of his speech. How so?
Well, I mean, the whole speech is disinformation because he's has this mythical, romantic view of the killing of bin Laden that's not rooted in the reality. And then, he's claiming the U.S. was an isolationist in the 30s, but the U.S. was a global empire starting in the late 19th century. And in the 30s, the FDR was had been the head of the secretary. I forget his position, but it was with the Navy. And he headed the Navy, and he was a big naval enthusiast. And he initiated a massive naval buildup in the Asia Pacific, and many historians believe that is a key factor that provoked, a Japanese counter response and led to the Pacific War. So where's the isolationism? I mean, it's not the accurate history, but I mean, these conventions just about political theater. But I mean, yeah, quoting Reagan. I mean, Reagan is the icon of the Republican. That's not even your party. So what is he doing quoting Reagan?
Well,
I mean,
he's
Reagan
the
was
same
a
thing that
right-wing extremist.
Barack Obama said that Reagan was his favorite president.
I know. And, it shows how far to the right the whole American spectrum has been, because Reagan, when he came up in the 60s, was viewed as a right-wing extremist, certainly by people in the anti-war and countercultural movement. And his whole theme was to attack the, mess at Berkeley and the student. How dare they question the Vietnam War? And then, when he came in, he veered American politics sharply to the right. He cut the corporate tax rate. And he ramped up U.S. militarism in Central America, and he wanted to avenge the Vietnam War. They called him Rambo Reagan, and you can't get him. This is like an icon of militarism and fascism, and they're quoting him. So, I mean, what kind of party is this? And we have two right-wing parties in our country. The political spectrum has shifted so far to the right, and it's created a dystopia we're discussing here, where we invest $1 trillion on warfare, these morally bankrupt wars, and our own society is filled with pathologies and major social ills, and we never address them, so they grow worse and worse. And we're not investing in our youth in education. I mean, where I live, the teachers are so poorly paid, it's just a disgrace. And you have third world conditions, like the schools. There were protests in my state a few years ago, and I covered those protests for a local newspaper. And there are people showing me on their phone who taught in schools in rural areas. And, I've traveled in Africa and third world countries, and what they were showing me is from a third world country. There was no proper sanitation in their school. There were not enough seats for the students, and these are high school teachers trying to keep them in school. So, I mean, the government is failing its citizens, and this is Reaganomics 101. So we've got to get beyond that, but they're touting this guy as a hero. That's terrible.
And again, I think this will be the final question, but the longer we talk, the more questions because of your insight. You mentioned that we're dealing with two right-wing parties. Are we dealing with two right-wing parties that are representing different interests of the right-wing elite?
Yes, absolutely. The GOP has always been rooted in the oil industry, the extractive industry, because their environmental policy is very favorable to big business and extractive industries and big oil. I think the military industries have hedged their bets now with both parties. Mm-hmm. Traditionally, like in the Reagan era, the Reagan Republican got a lot of support in states that had big military industry. Like California used to be a center of the Republican domination, and states like Arizona and the Southwest. But I think the Democrats under Clinton started courting the military contractors, and now they hedge their bets on both parties. I mean, there are certain cultural issues. The right wing, the evangelical churches who are very gung ho about things like against abortion. That's a certain spectrum that supports the Republican Party. The Democrats go for this diversity, and they court the African American vote, but they do so really based more on symbolism than actually delivering for the Black population. And that's, I think, something that the Black population, I think we'll see more and more of them maybe leaving the Democrat, because they're not getting anything. They're just getting the symbolism of some Black elected officials, but they're not getting benefits to their communities. And there have been studies about this. And I heard Michael Eric Dyson, who was it? It was Michael Eric Dyson, came to where I live, and he gave a talk. He had done a study. It was him. Oh, no, it was Tavis Smiley, who used to work for PBS. He did a big study on Black America and the state of Black America, and he found it got worse under Obama. Certain core thing like income and business ownership and education, because the Democrat weren't delivering on a concrete social program that would benefit their community. So it's more of the symbolism, and that's how they get votes. But
and as we get out, I want to read this quickly, because again, folks, here on Connecting the Dots, we connect the dots we provide data to support statements made. You talked about the defense industry funding both parties, and Dave Calhoun, who was the CEO of Boeing, when asked in July of 2020 who Boeing would prefer, Trump or Biden, and this is from CNBC, Boeing CEO Dave Calhoun said that he was confident that whoever wins the White House in November, whether it's Donald Trump or Vice President Biden, will continue supporting the defense industry. Quote, I think both candidates, at least in my view, appear globally oriented and interested in the defense of our country, and I believe they will support the industries. They'll do it in different ways, and they'll have different terms, different teams for sure, but I don't think we're going to take a position on one being better than the other. And Dr. Jeremy Kuzmarov, that I think is clear evidence of the point you made, that we're dealing with two wings on the same bird.
Absolutely. And viewers can go to opensecrets.com and look at well-known politicians where they get their money. I mean, look up Joe Biden, because I've done it. You'll see he gets a ton of money from Lockheed Martin. And yeah, the Democrats seem, in some, I think they're getting more. Democrats now are getting more from the military contractor because they're even more hawkish, especially like on Ukraine. That's been a big boon for a company like Boeing and Lockheed and surveillance industry. So I think they like Democrats even more now, and Democrats are positioning themselves to the right and more hawkish on foreign policy. And even the border, I have an article next week on the border issue. Democrats are more to the right than Republican as far as spending on like border surveillance. And that's a big industry, border surveillance, drones, and that's part of the military industrial complex.
So I said this was the last question. This is the last question, and you can just answer this yes or no. All this conflation of the border, whether you're Donald Trump or whether you're Kamala Harris, whether you're Joe Biden or whoever, all of this talk about the border, building the wall, security systems, drones, a lot of money on the border. They don't talk about the U.S. foreign policy that is driving people from Colombia, from Guatemala, from Mexico to the border, because the United States policy is decimating their economies. And quick point, people, you can look this up. About 3 weeks ago, Chiquita Brands was convicted in federal court in Florida of sponsoring death squads in Colombia, and now Chiquita Brands has to pay millions of dollars in reparations and damages to these victimized families in Colombia. Kamala Harris isn't talking about that. Donald Trump is. You want to deal with the border, deal with the decimation of these. Ask the question, why are Haitians coming here? Because the United States is trying to reinvade Haiti. Again, Jeremy, that in and of itself is another show. 30 seconds. Am I right?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's no debate about that. And it's been a bipartisan foreign policy that caused that vast immigration. And also you have to look, that caused the wreckage in those economies and societies. And you have to look at the free trade agreement. The Clinton administration promoted the NAFTA, and that helped decimate Mexican agriculture and forced a lot of the Mexicans to come to the United States. So nobody questioned the free trade laws. That's a big factor inducing immigration, including especially from Mexico. So they ought to address revising those laws and creating a fairer world economy. But that might erode U.S. primacy and the primacy of the dollar, and they don't want that. So it's better to beef up the border, boost the coffer to Lockheed Martin instead of doing that.
Dr. Jeremy Kuzmarov. In fact, here's one of the books, Warmonger. I got it.
Great. Thank you.
Oh, hey, man. Great work. Great work. Dr. Jeremy Kuzmarov, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Great conversation.
Hey, folks, thank you all so much for listening to the Connecting the Dots podcast with me, Dr. Wilmer Leon. Stay tuned for new episodes every week. Also, please follow and subscribe, leave a review, share the show, follow us on social media. You can find all the links below in the show description. Remember, this is where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge. Talks without analysis is just chatter, and we don't chatter here on Connecting the Dots. See you again next time. Until then, I'm Dr. Wilmer Leon. Have a great one. Peace. We're out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.